belong to
Above his pay
intelligence.
grade. Yeah, above his pay
Yeah.
grade.
So like
Yeah.
you look at the people around him that, or anyone in the future, because this will happen again, I assure you, and see who's connected to whom, and then use the Rockefeller um, sort of like that playbook, and look at these people differently, and then see what else they've done, and that will give you the stones to start connecting these dots easily without you depending on mainstream will never tell you, so you have to figure it out either by listening to Shaun or me or other people like us. But anyway, Clive Davis, we're getting to him, born on April 4th, 1932. He was actually the protege of Meyer Lansky. And by the way, I live on the Upper West Side of New York City, and I live very close to a place that both Wexy and Clive Davis keep an apartment at. And that is, they keep an apartment at 15 Central Park West. It is on 59th Street. And so we have Wexy, who purchased an apartment there many years ago for his mother-in-law. And then we have Clive Davis, who loves that apartment. It's got, and you know why they love it, Shaun?
Why?
I didn't send you a picture, but I will. Not now, because I don't know how to do two things at once here. But because, like, you know, there are some buildings that have an inner courtyard that you don't have to, like, get out of your car on the street. There has an inner courtyard, so the car can kind of pull in and nobody sees you. And so it offers them that privacy. But to think that Wexner and Clive Davis have an apartment in the same building is really, it's, you know, and it's walking distance to Jay-Z has an apartment on 57th Street. And I wasn't going to share this, but should I?
Yes, please do.
Well, this is not even anything I shared with anybody yet, but so you guys are the first to hear. There's a man by the name of Bernie Kornfeld who helped Hugh Hefner with the tunnels under the Hefner mansion in California. Bernie Kornfeld had also a group of very young girls as his, let's call it harem, but these were very young girls. There are photographs you can probably pull up. When Jay-Z was arrested for that stabbing incident that I'm not going to go into, there was a mugshot taken of him, and it showed the address of 152 West 57th Street. I happen to know from other sources that I will not reveal that that building does not only have family members of Bernie Kornfeld who helped Hefner and other things with the tunnels that in fact reach into other properties, right? So that, and the only way you can have access to a property in that building is to be an insider. So Jay-Z is frankly above many people to have been allowed that. That said, having these apartments like Clive Davis having one on 59th Street, it's walking distance to many places. Let's say walking distance to Trump Tower, walking distance to many places where all of these guys congregate. So in any event, to get back to Davis, he attended Harvard Law School in 1956, and then he began working for a law firm that represented CBS. And then they inquired when he was working as an attorney, as a young attorney, if he wanted to come and work for them as their in-house attorney. And he's like, yeah, and that was in 1965. And then by 1967, he becomes the president. He too had, let's say, a mentor, but we're not going to get into him today because I want to tell you so much. Time only permits. So, but I'm going to tell you, he's credited with discovering, among others, Janis Joplin, Carlos Santana, the Grateful Dead, Billy Joel, Aretha Franklin, Bruce Springsteen, Herbie Hancock, Rod Stewart, Prince, Aerosmith, Whitney Houston, God rest her soul, Pink Floyd, Jimi Hendrix, The Who, Luther Vandross, Patti Smith, Alicia Keys, Usher, and many others. So at one point in an interview, Clive was asked that working in hip hop is a long way from, let's say, working with Barry Manilow. And so the question was, what was it like creating the hip hop label The Face back in 1989? And he, you know, he is the best marketer. I mean, this guy knows every trick. So he said, I've always tried to supplement what I could do with the greater expertise of others. Knowing that R&B music was changing and that hip hop was arriving, I turned to LaFace, whose name is Kenneth Edmonds, to develop TLC and, the other one. And then, of course, he credits him for Usher and Pink. And then, are you aware that he is still going to host his pre-Grammy parties despite the raging fires in California?
No, it's not well.
But doesn't it scream SATANI? Like doesn't because everybody else, almost all of the other people who have parties and companies, they said they will not have celebrations this year because of the fires. Clive Davis, who was 92 people, 92, he's like, no, the party is on, of course, because he is. I look at him and I see little horns coming out of his head, a little tail. But and guess who's going to be there? Jay-Z with his wife Beyonce. So yeah, he's going to have the party. So now, guys, in 1973, Davis is suddenly fired from CBS. William Paley has been pretty much put into the hot seat. He has to fire Clive Davis in 1973, although they're basically doing the same thing, and one hand washes the other. But he is fired along with another person that I'll name and some other people connected to the mafia for basically they claim it's improperly misappropriating funds to influence DJs into playing specifically Black music. The reason he wants to do this is to infiltrate the Black communities, right? Because you want every segment of the population to be able to control them through the use of music. And so the way that they were doing it is not dissimilar from the way it had been done 20 years earlier or 40 years earlier, but they discovered that Davis and others paid in the form of, let's say, substance and how do we call them? Entertainers of a very personal nature. How would we call that?
Adult entertainers?
Yes. Well, who do the deed.
Yeah, ladies of the night or men of the night?
Yes, these people and of all ages, okay, to provide them free of charge, clearly, because you want to do that, not just to the DJs, but also to the musicians. And why to the musicians? To keep them in line. Not just keep them in line because, let's say, you get somebody like Janis Joplin hooked on drugs, right? And then conveniently there's an overdose, right? But also because you have blackmail material and or they don't get far. They just, if they don't toe the line, so they use this as a tool to grease the wheels, to have the music play. So we have not music, let's say, that was everybody fell in love with and ran out and bought. We have music that was paid for, people were bribed. So, but this eventually got out, and he was in the middle of this really horrific scandal. Now, it happened in 1973 at the same time that the Watergate. Remember Watergate?
Yep, the plumbers.
Yeah, Richard Nixon, the crowd. Do you know that this was front page news next to Watergate, and it almost kicked Watergate off the front page?
Wow.
It was a very big thing. So there were these conventions for that CBS had for their people, let's say. And again, that very famous hooker called the Indian, the events called the circus. Now we can only imagine what happened at their circus events, right? Like wink, wink. And the prevalence at these conventions of drugs and spiked drinks. So people who were basically yes men around our friend Clive Davis were like, oh, how could he be part of anything like this? You can't even say, let's say, call it a green, right?
Yep, the green, yep.
You can't even say green around him because he's such a straight-laced guy. And but the reality was that he was anything but. So like from the very first rumors, there was talk of this very mysterious receptionist, which by the way disappeared. Her name was Fran. Fran, rest in peace, because I'm sure they didn't let you go peacefully into whatever. But apparently she used to show up repeatedly at work at CBS, you know, the Columbia Broadcasting thing run by Clive. And she would be, let's say, she would have substances in her system. And she would be the one, however, who would be taking the call. So she knew who was calling and what they were talking about. They immediately got rid of Fran. And then there was talk about a man named Frank Campana, who worked at Columbia and who had been a friend of another man named Pat. And then later, the name Falcone came up. And apparently, Falcone was known in the mafia. And so these things were, you know, slowly, basically came to the surface. And it was discovered that, in fact, there was stuff like this going on. There were mafia ties that were exposed. And he was fired. Clive Davis was fired at the end of January, I think it was, in 1973, because it was a major international brown smuggling operation. Okay.
Yeah.
Brown. And that came into the light. And the bust, which reported $15 million, centered in Montreal. And then it involved a bunch of people, but one of them was, you know, very close to Davis, Pasquale Falcone, you know, called Patsy by his friends, who was a member of the Genovese crime family. And so if I say Genovese, does it remind you of Wexy or?
Well, you reminded me of the Colombian cartel because they were linked with Falcone as well, weren't they?
Yeah, I think so. And then we have the fact that, remember, in 1985, Wexy's attorney, Arthur Shapiro, took 2 bullets to the head, mob style, and that analysis that was discovered by then Columbus chief James Jackson destroyed all the evidence about the investigation because it linked 2 of the richest citizens of Ohio, meaning Edward DeBartolo Sr. and Leslie Wexner, to the Genovese organized crime family. So that we have a straight line connection. I mean, there are many of them, frankly, but we have a straight line connection to, let's say, from Wexy to Clive Davis, you know, pretty much almost at the same time. So Falcone, you know, clearly he was operating. It was a much bigger thing. I mean, there were operations in Canada. There were operations in Mexico. They were also, in fact, dealing with the so-called Black Mafia in Harlem. This was a big deal. However, David Winshaw, who was 52 and who was the basically the right hand person to Clive Davis, was the person who took the fall. He was also fired. He was, these guys were arrested. I'm going to say that Winshaw regrettably took the fall for Clive Davis, who was found to have been guilty only of, let's say, not paying his tax. He was fined $10,000. And, he didn't spend a day in jail. But of course, Patsy Falcone spent time in jail, as did